Imagine you are lying flat on your back in the middle of one of the most hostile environments on the North American continent. The air is not air, it is a living wall of sound. A vibration so dense, so constant, that it presses against your eardrums like a physical object. The darkness around you moves, not from wind, not from water. It moves because the darkness itself is made of wings, billions of them. And yet, the people who lived here did not simply endure this, they slept, deeply, deliberately, without modern repellents, without sealed shelters, without any of the chemical barriers we now consider essential to basic survival in this landscape. They lay down in the middle of it, and they rested, not because they had no choice, because they had a system so precise, so layered and so counterintuitive that even today, when examined through the lens of modern environmental engineering, it reveals an intelligence that most people never expect to find in a story about insects and mud. The question is not how they survived. The real question is, how did they turn a cloud of predators into a manageable environment as night after night, with nothing but what the swamp itself provided? To understand that, we need to look much closer than most people ever have. If you find yourself thinking deeply about what human beings are truly capable of, the kind of knowledge that gets passed down, not in books, but in the body itself, this is exactly the kind of channel you should be subscribed to. And if you're watching this from somewhere that has its own invisible history of adaptation, drop a comment and tell us where you're from. Because the answer to what we're about to explore is not where most people think to look. Most people, when they imagine indigenous peoples sleeping outdoors in mosquito-dense environments, arrive at the same explanation almost instantly: endurance, tolerance. The idea that after generations of exposure, the human body simply adapted, that the skin hardened, that the immune response dulled, that what would be agony for a modern person was simply background noise for someone who had known nothing else. This interpretation feels logical. It even feels respectful in a certain way. It acknowledges difficulty without denying it. But it is wrong, not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Because it starts from the assumption that what these peoples did was absorb punishment, when in reality what they built was a defense architecture. The difference between those two things is not semantic. It is the difference between a man walking through fire and a man wearing a suit designed to redirect heat. The outcome might look similar from a distance. The engineering beneath it is completely different. The nations of the lower Mississippi Delta, the Choctaw, the ancestors of the Seminole, and the many confederated peoples who moved through that landscape did not develop a tolerance for mosquito swarms. They developed a system for defeating them, and that system operated on at least 3 distinct levels simultaneously: the chemical, the structural, and the psychological. Remove any one of those levels and the entire architecture collapses, which is exactly what made it so difficult to understand from the outside. It never looked like engineering. It looked like ritual. It looked like habit. It looked to every early outside observer who wrote about it like something mysterious or instinctive. This was not instinct, this was design. It was generations of accumulated experimental knowledge encoded into practice so refined that it no longer required explanation. It simply worked. And to see why it worked, you have to start at the surface. Literally, at the skin itself. The first element of the system was what some researchers have come to call biological armor. The formulation varied by nation and by season, but the principle was consistent: a dense, multifunctional paste applied to every exposed surface of the body before rest. In the delta regions, this compound was typically built from river clay, the fine-grained, mineral-rich sediment found along slow-moving tributaries, combined with rendered animal fat, most commonly bear grease, and a binding compound derived from the boiled inner bark of black walnut or butternut trees. This was not a simple coating. Each component performed a distinct function, and the interaction between them was the point. The clay provided a physical barrier, a layer dense enough that a mosquito's proboscis, which operates at a specific insertion depth calibrated for soft, warm tissue, could not reliably reach the skin's surface. But clay alone dries, cracks, and loses integrity within an hour in the humid night air. This is where the bear grease became structurally essential. Fat is hydrophobic. It binds to the clay particles and prevents the rapid desiccation that would otherwise fracture the barrier. It also reduces the thermal signature of the skin, because fat conducts heat differently than exposed tissue, lowering the infrared signal that many mosquito species use as a targeting mechanism over short distances. This was not primitive medicine. The walnut extract completed the system in a way that neither clay nor fat could achieve alone. Black walnut contains high concentrations of juglone, a compound with measurable insect deterrent properties that also binds to skin proteins, creating a slow-release chemical boundary that extended the functional life of the entire compound through the night. The smell to a human was strong but tolerable. To the olfactory sensors of a mosquito, which are calibrated specifically to carbon dioxide and lactic acid, the chemical signatures of warm blood, the juglone compound created interference, a kind of chemical noise that disrupted the targeting signal before the insect ever reached proximity. Together, these three elements functioned less like a lotion and more like a layered countermeasure system, each layer compensating for the limits of the one beneath it. But the biological armor was only the first layer, and here is where the engineering becomes genuinely surprising, because the second system operated not on the body, but on the environment itself, and it was built before anyone lay down to sleep. The sleeping platforms used throughout the Delta wetlands, structures known in various forms across multiple indigenous traditions, sometimes called barbacoa in contact-era Spanish records, were not simply elevated beds. Elevation alone solves one problem: ground humidity. But in a mosquito-dense environment, elevation introduces a problem that most people don't consider. Height, in a still-air environment, actually increases exposure. Without shelter, an elevated sleeper is more exposed to airborne insects than someone lying at ground level surrounded by vegetation. So why elevate at all? Because the platforms were not designed for still air. They were designed for a specific atmospheric phenomenon that occurs every night in lowland river environments, the nocturnal temperature inversion layer. As temperatures fall after sunset in wetland biomes, a thin current of marginally cooler, drier air begins to move along the surface of the land at a height between 2 and 4 meters above the ground. This current is not wind in the traditional sense. It does not gust or change direction erratically. It flows steadily, predictably, following the topography of the landscape toward lower ground and open water. It is invisible, nearly imperceptible at ground level, but it is consistent. The people of the lower Mississippi Delta had observed this phenomenon across generations and encoded that observation into the height of their sleeping structures. The platforms were built specifically to intercept this layer, to place a resting body inside a continuous, low-velocity airflow that mosquitoes, which are physiologically sensitive to air currents above 2 kilometers per hour, cannot navigate effectively. This was not accidental placement. The height of these structures was not arbitrary. It was calibrated. The platforms were not as high as possible. They were as high as necessary to access a specific atmospheric resource that most observers never knew existed. And directly beneath them, something else was happening that made the entire system function as a unified mechanism rather than a collection of separate techniques. Below the sleeping platforms, fires were maintained through the night. But these were not warming fires. They produced almost no heat. They were smoke fires, built from green moss, wet decomposed wood, and specific wetland plant material chosen precisely because it produced dense, cool, chemical-rich combustion byproducts. The smoke from these materials is fundamentally different from the smoke produced by dry wood. It is heavier. It disperses horizontally rather than rising vertically in a column, and it contains compounds, specifically terpenes, and volatile organic acids found in the decomposing organic matter that are acutely disorienting to the chemoreceptor systems that mosquitoes use to track carbon dioxide gradients. These fires were not pushing mosquitoes away through heat or density. They were creating a chemical interference field directly beneath the sleeping area, a zone of disrupted sensory signal that the insects could not navigate without abandoning their tracking orientation entirely. The platform intercepted the air current above. The smoke fires created a disrupted zone below. The sleeping body existed between two systems, one that actively moved air across it, and one that chemically scrambled the environment beneath it. This was not survival. This was engineering. And yet, even with the biological armor intact and the structural systems in place, there remained a third layer, the one that almost never appears in any account, the one that is the most difficult for the modern mind to categorize, because it does not fit neatly into the language of either technology or medicine. The people who slept in these environments understood something about the human nervous system that modern sleep science is only now beginning to describe in precise terms. They knew that the greatest threat to a resting body in a mosquito-heavy environment was not the insect itself. It was the response to the insect, specifically the reflex, the automatic, involuntary, culturally reinforced compulsion to scratch. A single scratch response does three things simultaneously. It fractures the clay barrier, it opens a micro-abrasion in the skin surface that releases a burst of lactic acid and carbon dioxide into the immediate atmosphere, and it produces movement, which reactivates the motion-sensitive targeting behavior of mosquitoes that had previously lost interest. One scratch, in other words, restarts the entire threat cycle from the beginning. The suppression of this reflex was not a minor skill. It was a trained cognitive and somatic discipline, what the broader tradition might describe as the stilling of the reactive body, and it was taught progressively, beginning in childhood, not through punishment or rigid instruction, but through graduated exposure. Young members of these communities were introduced to discomfort in controlled, escalating contexts, learning first to remain still under minor irritation, then under greater stimulus, building over years the neural capacity to observe sensation without generating a motor response. What modern neuroscience would recognize as interoceptive regulation, the ability to monitor bodily sensation without escalating into autonomic reactivity, was encoded into the developmental experience of these children as a fundamental life competency. This was not tolerance. This was trained neural architecture. The practical result was a resting body that, even in a cloud of insects, produced minimal movement, minimal chemical signal disruption, and therefore minimal retargeting stimulus. The clay armor redirected the proboscis. The platform and smoke system disrupted navigation, and the trained stillness of the body ensured that neither system was compromised by the one variable that neither chemistry nor architecture could control: the person inside them. When all three layers operated simultaneously, the system achieved something that should not have been possible. A human body, in the most mosquito-dense environment in North America, sleeping through the night with a disruption rate low enough to constitute genuine rest, not stolen minutes of exhausted unconsciousness, structured, restorative sleep, functional enough to support sustained physical activity in the days that followed. This changes everything about how we understand what these people were doing out there. If you've made it this far, you're probably the kind of person who sees something like this and wonders, what else have we been looking at without actually seeing? If that question matters to you, subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Because this kind of knowledge existed in many places, and some of you watching right now come from traditions with their own invisible systems. We'd like to know. What becomes clear when all three systems are laid side by side is that none of them were designed to function in isolation. The clay compound only worked if the person inside it remained still. The smoke fires only disrupted mosquito navigation if the platform above them was positioned within the correct atmospheric layer to prevent the smoke from being swept away. The trained stillness of the body only preserved the integrity of the clay barrier if the barrier itself was properly formulated with fat and juglone, because a compromised compound, cracked by dryness, would trigger discomfort responses that no amount of psychological training could suppress indefinitely. Remove any single element and the system degrades. Not partially, it collapses. The chemical layer fails without stillness. The structural layer fails without the chemical layer. The psychological discipline fails without a physical substrate worth protecting. This is the architecture of integrated intelligence, not a collection of tricks accumulated over time. A designed system in which each component was the load-bearing element for every other. So a system in which the engineering was not written down, not stored in any library, but transmitted through practice, observation, and the lived accumulation of consequence. Generation after generation, refining not just what worked, but why it worked, in a language that was entirely embodied. We stand now in a moment when our most sophisticated industries spend vast resources developing multi-layered systems to protect human beings in hostile environments. Thermal barrier suits, chemical filtration membranes, behavioral conditioning protocols for high-stress operators. We have given these things new names and calibrated them with instruments, but the logic is not new. This was not primitive ingenuity. This was an engineering tradition as rigorous as anything that would be produced for centuries after contact, built not in laboratories, but in the only laboratory that ultimately matters, the sustained, high-stakes encounter between human intelligence and a world that does not accommodate error. The people of the lower Mississippi Delta did not sleep in spite of the swarm. They slept because they understood it. They mapped its physics. They disrupted its navigation. They trained their own bodies to cease being the signal it was searching for. And when the system worked, and it worked night after night across generations, what remained was not the image of endurance. What remained was something far more precise, a human body, motionless on a platform 2 meters above the swamp floor, resting inside a corridor of moving air, surrounded by a world of predators that could not find it. Not hidden, not protected by walls, simply engineered to be invisible.